Hello. Welcome to this afternoon's panel. Today, we're going to go over some of the more urgent, timely questions about a transition in Iran, focusing on how to neutralize the regime's security forces while maintaining and reestablishing a security establishment, managing sensitive military assets such as the ballistic missile arsenal and, of course, the nuclear program. And then we'll get into discussing how a democratic Iran can reassure regional partners and neighbors of its intentions, preventing instability and foreign interference after the fall of a regime. So we'll start with Behnam and Cameron. First, I want to ask, why is this topic so important? And then if you can get into what are the concrete steps necessary to neutralize the regime's existing security apparatus while maintaining and safeguards and establishing necessary political institutions. Of course, a successful transition away from the regime's security-focused governance will be essential to this rebuilding process. So if you could get into that, please.
There we go. And this is all in 1 minute and on the record?
You have time. You have time.
It's a tough act to follow, especially after the Crown Prince, and thank you to Nufti for hosting this very timely event on the future of Iran, because we've long suffered from an imagination problem, the lack of imagination, the lack of creativity, the lack of that belief, as Shahzada just mentioned, to think of something else and to help make the policymakers, petition our policymakers, because we do live largely in democratic societies, to envision something else rather than these paradigms we hear today, bad deal, bad war, things of that nature. And one of the major impediments, realistically, not ideologically, that we face is the costs of transition. So before we get into that laundry list, and I will hand it over to my friend Kamran in 1 second to begin to talk about how to do that, this is not selfish, but I do want to stress the importance of this panel. Without the proper transition and without a managed transition, everything else here is for naught. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. Everything else here will be for naught. We live in the Middle East, or ancestrally we have roots in the Middle East, better put. That is a situation, that is a place, with the exception of some places, that can get and has gotten from bad to worse. You have to plan, you have to have a plan B, C, D, E, F. I'm glad there is the pre-planning being done by IPP today, but we have to think and speak honestly and daringly and long and hard about taboo subjects, about military force, about conscription versus ideological volunteers in some of these security forces. We have to talk very hard about things that we've seen in other authoritarian societies in managed transition, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, be it Brazil or Argentina or South Africa as models. We have to think very critically about the kind of society that you want to create, because the way a transition happens, limited strike, regime dissolution, popular uprising, popular revolution, major foreign interference, state protests plus foreign support, whatever vector you have in your mind over dinner or tea over the past 40 some odd years, you've discussed, you've thought of, you've wanted, you've feared, we have to have those conversations now openly and honestly, and no more filters. Because without a proper understanding of the management process for a transition and what could happen and what could go wrong, I stress again, everything else could be for naught. This is not to dissolve the hope, but this is to make sure that you can move from hope to belief. Because if you don't have a blueprint of the current situation, if you don't know what is worth fighting, killing, and dying for, you will not get out of this management process the right way, and we might not have an Iran after this. That's the stakes. So forgive me for being so serious on such a hot day and otherwise such an inspirational panel, but that's why I'm stressing this, because this is what the Islamic Republic is dangling against us. The costs of managing this transition, making you, just like the Iranian people in Iran, look to their left, look to their right, the dangling of the Syria model, Assad or we burn the country, you know the things they say. But you also know the costs of the Islamic Republic staying in power, because it also is leading to the disillusion of Iran. So that's why the proper planning, the proper contingencies for such a transition is critical. And at the heart of that in my view, talking to friends here who are largely like-minded and working and coordinating and talking with folks like Nufti, and thanks to the leadership of Nufti, one of the best ideas that has come out is not just maximum pressure, is not just maximum support. It's something you've heard from the Crown Prince himself, marrying these two things with a third thing, which is maximum defections, winning over, neutralizing the security forces, because otherwise we are unfortunately talking about a very messy proposition.
Thank you, Behnam. That leads into what I wanted to get to next with Cameron, which is, as these concrete steps begin to be taken, how important are the policies of maximum support and specifically encouraging defections, and how do you manage the risks that stems from neutralizing a security force and the personnel that comes out of that?
Well, first of all, welcome to our friends from FDD, and thank you so much for being with us, and thanks to all of you. Before I answer your question specifically, I just want to say how pleased I am with the IPP team for not only tackling the first group, which they presented to you this morning, but for already getting underway on group 2, of which security is a critical part. The governance transformation that IPP is preparing for, you'll hear about not only in this panel, but in the subsequent panels today. So this work is already beginning. So luckily I have a bit of a cheat sheet that I can use to answer your question, because the experts are already starting to put it together. There are two critical things, I think, that have to be done in the lead up to the transition itself, policy-wise. One is inside Iran, and one is in relation to Western policy. So when it comes to Western policy, I think, first of all, it's recognizing that the solution to Iran is an Iranian solution. It's not a Western-imposed solution. I think that the people in the Middle East have learned that. Americans have learned that. Perhaps not all American policymakers have learned that. But most Americans, I think, recognize that simply taking a model that necessarily works in the United States or elsewhere and forcing it onto any country, particularly a country with 2,500 years of civilization like Iran, is a recipe for disaster. In the past 2 decades, we've seen the United States get bogged down in messy quagmires in the Middle East, perhaps with good intentions, but with methods in which they tried to force or choose their own candidate, whether it was getting rid of Zahir Shah in Afghanistan, whether it was forcing in their own man in Iraq. So first of all, Western policy has to recognize that the change, at least the change that we seek, and Behnam talks about multiple theories of change, the theory of change that we advocate and we think will have the least costs both to Iranians, the region, and the world, is an Iranian process, one that's led by the people of Iran, in which they're supported, not in which they're dictated to or decided for or on behalf of. So it's important that people in Washington, in the media, recognize that we're not looking for U.S. troops on the ground. We're not looking for American boots. American blood doesn't need to be spilt to solve another crisis in the Middle East. The people of Iran have voluntarily and far too often spilt their own blood to bring about this change, and what they deserve is our support. What they deserve is pressure on the regime. So we don't need American decision makers or other European decision makers to set what the future of Iran will be, because there's a lot of fear mongering about that right now. That if you don't pressure the regime, then it's going to, or if you do pressure the regime, it's going to lead to war, or if you do support the Iranian people, it's going to be another quagmire like Iraq or Afghanistan. Those are blatant lies. That is Qatari propaganda. That is the money of billions of dollars of Qatar and other terrorist states pouring in to American media, public institutions, universities, pushing their own propaganda. And it couldn't be anything further from the truth. So that's the first point. The second point is related to inside Iran and specifically the point of defections. There's also a lot of fear-mongering about this by some, I think, Iranians, some activists or others saying, "Na mibakhshim, na faramush mikonim." We will neither forget nor will we forgive. If we are to try to transition Iran from the dictatorship and the bloodletting of the Islamic Republic and follow it up immediately with more bloodletting, I mean, the Prince has told us for nearly half a century now, that simply won't work. All you have to do is look at other historical examples to see that if your immediate first step will be to round every cleric up and hang him from a tree, as much as I'm sure many of us might like to see that happen, that's not necessarily a recipe for sustainable democracy. We have to be able to bring people from the regime's security establishment to the side of the Iranian people, have them not turn their guns on the nation, but turn them away from the nation and refuse to slaughter Iranians in the street. And that will be uncomfortable at times. That will require people who have done some bad things in the past, people who have stolen the nation's money, to be at least temporarily brought to be part of the solution. Because it's very easy to emotionally say, we're going to find them all, we're going to round them up, we're going to kill them all and throw them in jail. But the real way, in my view, and I've learned this from the prince, to honor the sacrifices of Sarina, who we saw this morning, or Massa, or Puyo, or Navid, is not to have bloodlust, but it's to honor their memory by letting the people who would have been their age at some point live in peace. And we won't be able to have that peace in Iran or in the Middle East or with other countries if we go into this cycle of vengeance. So it will require sacrifices, difficult decisions, to bring some people who have done bad things and been on the wrong side of history to come to this side if we're going to win with that less costly means of transition.
Thank you. You both mentioned Syria, and I want to get into some lessons on what's happened in Syria towards the end. But Eyal, first, I want to turn to you for countries in the region, specifically Israel, will, of course, be seeking reassurances from a future Iranian government. Can you broadly speak about what are some key reassurances you or Israel or other countries in the region would be looking for, and what specifically might concern you to see, whether it's armed forces, ballistic missiles, loose nuclear material, just broadly?
First, let me start by saying that I'm honored to be here. It feels like I'm among an extended family. My ancestors immigrated from Persia, from Jarahum and Shiraz area. Elina, who knows, maybe our ancestors were neighbors sometime 100 years ago. And I'm honored to be here side by side with Nufdi and the Crown Prince and friends in FDD in doing so. Because there is it's a big task ahead. I will answer your question and then give another comment. First, I mean, when we in Israel look at what Iran could look like, then of course there is the dream, which I'm sure we all share, that a person like the Crown Prince will be able to come to Iran for a transition period, create a unified democracy that will grant the rights to the minorities and harness all of the quality and talent that there is in this wonderful nation. Maybe some of the diaspora will come back to help build this country when something like this happens. This is how the dream will ultimately fulfill. But this is not the only optional outcome that will come from a regime collapse, right? And I think that what you've said before, and I won't repeat, just strengthen, for the outcome to be like that, the movement needs to be very, very capable and ready. Because it, obviously, you mentioned Syria and other instances. When we look at what happens to countries that collapse in a region and the regime is overthrown, of course, they're not well educated and civilized like the Iranians. There are other countries and nations in them, but you know, it is hard that the result will not be that the second strongest man in the country will take the country under its control with the power of the arms. And in the case of Iran, there are so many of them that just stand in line, right? IRGC. So, okay, Qasem Soleimani isn't there anymore, but, you know, there are others with some capability. So I think the importance of preparing well is indeed so. And my response to your question, of course, depends on what will be the outcome. as you all know, until 79, the relationship between Israel and Persia at the time, or Iran before the revolution, we were strong allies. I have friends who were born in Iran because their parents participated in assisting your security establishment or the industry or infrastructure, water industry, building industry. So many Israelis have served significant amount of time in collaboration with the former Iran. I wish this could resume quickly. And if that resumes quickly, and if Iran in the mindset will devote its resources and attention for the prosperity of the people in the country, other than for building an arsenal that will serve to arm or support our enemies, then of course all of this can happen. And all I can say is that I'm sure that Israel will support that end, but we'll also be very, very careful to see that other things do not happen. Israel, I'm sure, I mean, you all must know that Crown Prince left. I would have said it even if it was sitting here, but the Iranian nuclear program did not start with the revolutionary regime, right? The first seeds of that program backdate to different phases. I don't know what will be the attitude of that. I know that Israel will not be only welcoming, but also supporting and helping a regime that will be attuned to the people, to the prosperity of the region, to the collaboration across the region to bring peace for a change to our peace of world that we deserve so much. And I truly hope that it will be the outcome, and I truly hope in our lifetime we get to support and help this to fulfill.
Same, thank you. I'll turn back to the Iranian side of the panel. We'll go back to the transition process a little bit. I want to talk ballistic missiles, armed forces, and the nuclear program. So starting with ballistic missiles, as you know, Behnam, the Islamic Republic currently maintains the largest, most sophisticated ballistic missile arsenal in the region. How should that arsenal be managed post-regime collapse in a free, democratic Iran? What are the options? Is it dismantlement or converting to a transparent, defensive process? What are the options, and what should the incoming potential regime do?
All the easy questions, Andrew. What the? Obviously, the future defense doctrine, the future procurement of defense technologies, the retention of defense capabilities should be up to, and ideally is up to, the democratically elected leaders of Iran, period. Now, sitting here in the West, born and raised in the West of Iranian ancestry, what I have to tell you is it is one very noticeable thing, picking up on a thread that Eyal left off and then pivoting to the actual weapon. And that is power, particularly Iranian power. What a responsible, legitimate, secular, nationalist, democratic government in Tehran ought to do is to make sure that the fear of Iran's neighbors, of the West, of status quo powers around the world, is not of Iranian power. That is the number one fear. That they ought not to fear a strong, capable, defensive Iran. That instead what they ought to fear is a weak Iran that can't protect itself, that could become a playground for many of the other issues that we've seen for many years now across, unfortunately, the failed states and failed societies across the modern Middle East. How that relates to power and weapons is quite simple, because before 1979, Iranian power and Iranian weaponry, Western-supplied American jets, for example, was used to support the forces of the status quo. Since 1979, that power and that weaponry in whatever manifestation, okay, now after the revolution, not necessarily jets, more so ballistic missiles, they began to procure during the Iran-Iraq War, Syria, Libya, North Korea, scaled up, Russia, China, now they produce, procure, proliferate, and even sell these weapons. Iranian weapons are showing up on multiple continents around the world. Drones in Venezuela, ballistic missiles in Russia, you name it, these guys are trying to move into those markets. What a responsible, democratic, representative, secular, liberal, nationalist government should do is to remind people that Iranian power can be wielded in the region and in defense of its own interests as a force for the status quo, as a force for stasis, not as a force of revisionism. Because those are the ends, whatever the weapon, drone, missile, what have you, those are the weapons that are being used to revise the status quo that play on the security anxieties of Iran's neighbors, of the West, and in all of the status quo countries. So even though you asked a military question, the first way you begin to solve that is diplomatically. To diplomatically disarm the concerns that any, again, neighboring country, Western country, pro-status quo country would have about certain capabilities. From that will flow something technical. I think if you do get a liberal, nationalist, representative, democratic Iranian government, what that could actually beget is lots of arms control conversations. You can actually, rather than have an Islamic Republic of Iran, which is hedging towards a nuclear weapon, spooking an American partner in Saudi Arabia, spooking them to go towards domestic uranium enrichment, imagine if Iran was the standard for the rules in the region with which should be applied. Then you can take the positive standard and then have your Western partners workshop that to begin to give Iran's newfound Western allies leverage to say, hey, other Western partner in the region, don't do this bad thing, don't build this capability. With respect to missiles, certainly I think some classes of projectiles, if you're asking me as an independent observer still sitting here in Washington, certain classes ought to go. There are certain international standards, I won't bore you with them, for the missile technology control regime that has a certain payload, that has a certain range. Iran could be the beacon of saying, in this region, you can begin, for example, in the Persian Gulf. In this region, countries who produce these weapons don't exceed these ranges, these thresholds, these limitations. And then you become the gold standard. And then you lead by the power of your example. You don't lead with a proxy, you don't lead with arms proliferation, you lead by the power of your example, and you have everything you need to make sure that no one messes with you, but that you are the shining city on a hill. This is not about can Iran have a defense policy. This is the ends to which that defense policy is arrayed. And good diplomacy is the first stop towards making sure that a newfound Iranian government can defend the national interests, both in word and in deed.
Does that apply to the nuclear program as well?
I think it ought to apply to the nuclear program. If you're asking me again, sitting here still in Washington as an independent observer in the West, at FDD we've come up with a theory for if these, unfortunately, as they seem to be going, nuclear negotiations continue with the government of the Islamic Republic, why dismantlement has to be the case, right? Dismantlement, one reason why we're pushing for the theory of dismantlement, even though in the future civil nuclear power ought to be something that the Iranian people have the right to explore, just like they have the right to explore energy, just like they have the right to explore solar, gas, whatever. I'm not interested in the type of electricity generation, nor am I skilled enough to comment on it. What I am interested in, however, is making sure that the way the regime pursues this generation doesn't cause more concerns among Iran's neighbors that end up putting needless pressure on a newfound nascent, almost like a flower or a sapling of a new democratic government in Iran. Because the last thing you want is to have people have the same fears of a new Iran that they would of the old Iran. And with dismantlement, that's one easy way that you can get rid of that. And the bonus, if you actually go for dismantlements before you have a regime change in Tehran, yes, I just used the RC word in Washington, the bonus of dismantlement is you don't have to worry about a gigantic dispersed nuclear program being a gigantic AQCon network on steroids in the collapse of central authority. Because there are organs of many governments around the world whose job it is to assess risk and manage risk. And one of the reasons, we have to be honest, many Western governments have not gone after regime change is because Iran has increased the risk by producing more missiles, by producing more drones, by doing uranium enrichment, by having more nuclear facilities on their own soil. They are insuring themselves. They're saying, hey, if you decapitate me, if you topple me, this could just become loose nukes on steroids. So this is why we're pushing for dismantlement. This is why we're pushing for monitoring and verification. This can actually help you with that first concern I said, which is how will you manage the transition?
That's a very important point, that they're increasing the risk, and all the conversations we're having here is trying to lower the cost to counter that. Cameron, if you have anything to add to any of that?
I think there's two things. I feel like I'm often just correcting the record and not answering questions, but other people's false records or narratives. The first, and Behnam alluded to it, is another myth that is repeated in the media and in Washington, is that somehow the Islamic Republic's foreign policy or regional policy is something of a continuation of the foreign policy Iran had under the previous government, under the Pahlavi dynasty. I hear that argued by surprisingly, quote-unquote, serious people. Because they say that just as the late Shah was pursuing Iran's national interests, so the Islamic Republic is doing the same. I think it's very obvious that that's not the case. We can go example by example. Iran, its state infrastructure, its armed forces under the Islamic Republic are not that of a normal country. The IRGC that everyone loves to talk about does not even have, despite what some people who claim to be journalists think, have the word Iran in its name. It's not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, it's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The word Iran doesn't even come, I think, until the 7th clause of its charter. It's some, throwaway thing that some cleric said, hey, we should probably put the word Iran in here because people might get pissed, as if they could read. But the point is, it has nothing to do with Iran in the first place. It's not about defending Iran's territorial integrity. It's not about defending Iran's borders. It's not about protecting Iran's national interest. It's about guarding the interest and advancing and exporting the revolution. Sudur Enqilab, or the exportation of the revolution, is a commandment of the Islamic Republic's constitution. It's not a tactic that's used from here to there. It is a directive from Ruhollah Khomeini to future leaders and affiliates of the Islamic Republic. So to in any way say that there are similarities or that the regime is just pursuing Iran's national interest, we have to go point by point and show why that's not the case, not only to correct the record, but because it's important and instructive for the future. Because as Behnam said, and as Eyal alluded to, any normal government that comes to power in Iran with seeking the national interest would do things almost diametrically opposed to what the Islamic Republic has done. Anytime that Iran, under the late Shah, had a presence in the region, it was at the invitation of other countries. I mean, right now, quite ironically, the Omanis are playing a critical role, as we know, in hosting these so-called negotiations between the Trump administration and the Islamic Republic. Well, Sultan Qaboos wouldn't be sitting on anything except sand if it weren't for the late Shah of Iran, who at his request came in to crush a communist revolt. But Iran under the late Shah was not looking to gain territory. It wasn't there to radicalize local populations to become militias like it does with Hezbollah or Hamas or any of the groups. It was there to defend peace, as you said, Behnam, to defend the status quo of the region against a communist revolt. That is what we would look, I hope, to a future normal, secular, democratic Iranian state to do. And in fact, I think it aligns perfectly with President Trump's America First policy. It aligns perfectly with President Trump's desire to no longer have endless wars. If we have a strong, secular, democratic Iran in the Middle East that can be partners and friends with Israel, with the Saudis, with other countries in the Persian Gulf, then America doesn't have to constantly send its troops, its treasure to be killed, to be wasted in countries in the region that people don't know where they are or don't know why they're there, and that's reasonable. Americans shouldn't have to worry about their children going off to some random country in the Middle East where they may not have so many interests, but allowing that void to be there now only allows the Islamic Republic to fill it. However, if there were a normal Iran to be a peacemaker, to be a peace builder in the region, we wouldn't have any of those worries. And so I think that the Iran that we all seek, and the Iran that the second part of the IPP project is preparing the transition for, will look to institute the necessary post-Islamic reform, Islamic Republic reforms to ensure that we can show our neighbors exactly that, and that's what we mean.
The fallacies you mentioned remind me of the assertions that Iran, the regime in Iran is not trying to build a nuclear weapon at the moment, despite enriching 70% higher than they would need to for any civil nuclear program. And I think leads to what many of us have long argued, which is that the only long-term, permanent, real solution to the threat emanating from Iran, specifically the nuclear threat, is a free, democratic Iran and a new regime there. A deal kicking the can down the road does not solve that long term. Just sticking on the transition for one more question, we spoke ballistic missiles, we talked nuclear program. On the armed forces, which is a slightly probably different process than those two, how do you maintain and transform the military and intelligence institutions into transparent ones that respect civil liberties, that still serve the region, the national interest, while we're talking about neutralizing the security state?
Let me say briefly about what IPP is doing before you all give your expert views. So again, in the second group of IPP, which is governance transformation, just as we did in the first group, the team or the experts, thank God not me, but people who know what they're talking about when it comes to this, will be looking at a variety of case studies over time, post collapse transitions in different countries. How were armed forces, how were domestic security operations, how were police forces transformed? In the Iranian case, as I just alluded to, with the existence of this parallel military structure from the National Army of the IRGC, the task is quite difficult. Does one dissolve the IRGC? Does one make the two into one national force? Are they dismissed? The Crown Prince has talked, as you probably have all heard, numerous times about not repeating the mistake of the de-Baathification process in Iraq, which sent tens of thousands of young, angry, armed men back home to become ISIS or other militia groups. So the process that the IPP team will take is studying those different transitions, those post-collapse scenarios, what went well, what didn't go well. So I can't speak to what results they'll find, but that's at least the process that the IPP team will take.
I think what is important to remember in that, and Your Highness specifically, I think important to say this in your presence. For any of this transition to succeed, I think the cornerstone will be the ability of the future leadership to win the hearts and minds and imagination of the people of the country, I think, as you so eloquently said before in your remarks. Because even today, unfortunately, clearly there's a majority of the population in Iran, according to the polling that we're doing, that despise the regime and would want a change immediately. But there's still a substantial part of the citizens of Iran today that are either radicalized or just in support of the ideology, and they will not all disappear in a snap of a fingers. His Highness, I think you've said this right, and I think you're very thoughtful and deep in your thinking about this. And the question will be how fast and how many of them can transform to be the core of a new protective force with alliance to a leader that aspires for a thriving prosperity country. Not many of the transition countries in the Middle East were able to do this. So many of them have failed. And I think the process, Cameron, that you said, to learn from the experiences. And as I said before, I mentioned the different countries and the different peoples are not the Iranians with a deep, thoughtful culture. I think you will start from a better starting position. But the challenges will be there, and I know that you know them. So I think to think about transitioning of thought, understanding that some of those people align with the leadership at the moment, with the supreme leader, just because they have to, either because they're afraid or they know nothing else, because the country is so young and so many of them have been born only after you had to go to exile. And to think about how to harness that motivation, I think, will be crucial to the success. But together with that, to identify those who will never transform, will never give a chance to anything else, and will always be there to try to turn Iran back into darkness. This is going to be a very difficult task, and as I said before, in whatever circumstances, I do not speak on behalf of my country, but I sure am, will be there for you to help you in that process.
Just a couple more questions. We've alluded to Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan a little bit broadly. Can we talk about what are the key lessons learned from what's happened in Syria, and drawing upon the lessons and more broadly from Iraq and Afghanistan, what are some institutional frameworks and strategic priorities for a new government in Iran to take to avoid perceptions of insecurity, to avoid the regional actors feeling the need to intervene militarily? Behnam? Another easy one for you.
Yeah. Actually, just the last question, if we had to put a model, and correct me if you think it's wrong or it's too small, and again, I'm not a decision maker, but just looking analytically at the cases, a very important one comes to mind during the Cold War in the 60s and 70s, which is Israel's covert assistance and training to Singapore. The kind of training that could exist. I know there is an Iran example as well with Israel, but let's start fresh, let's start anew. If Iran is developing a more lean, modernized armed forces, there's a lot that the nascent or newer Iranian armed forces, if trimmed down, if not conglomerated with what's left of the conscripts of other forces, could learn. Not from Israeli command, but Israeli advice. That's just one example. Again, I'm not here to decide what is the best, but I'm here to say what are the options, what has and hasn't worked in history. You know, there are examples when you do take a militia and integrate it into an army and it works totally fine and you co-opt them into the national cause of the army. And then there's examples when you take a militia and you put them into the army and then they become the Trojan horse against the army and then they take the army towards their own ideology and they use all of the armed forces against the nascent state. So we have examples on both sides of the aisle. I think it's imperative for the folks engaging in the transition and especially the opposition to be aware of the models and the examples that they're choosing, the pros and cons of every example. There is no cookie-cutter example in history, and certainly there will not be a cookie-cutter example with respect to what replaces the Islamic Republic of Iran. And just because you mentioned Syria, Andrew, and not to continue to make this conversation boring, but I believe it is important to stress the details. The thing that comes most apparent to me about Syria is that it is totally possible to have a revolution turn into a civil war that ends up fostering so much foreign intervention, and then because the commitment of the initial protesting secular national democratic forces to some kind of broad form of patriotism is so great that they, after such a long protracted period, will have to settle for something like a rehabbed Al-Qaeda guy. If not only potentially not even rehabbed Al-Qaeda guy, just the Al-Qaeda guy who's done a close shave. And what a tremendous loss that would be to the movement, to everyone in this room, to the opposition, if it is musical chairs with the IRGC. If it is the debate over free, I'm just shooting names out here, but if it is between the kleptocrats of the era of Rafik Haddoust or the younger kind of more elite transnational shoppers like the children of Ghalili, like what a loss it would be if we had to settle for which militarized autocrat with foreign bank accounts do you prefer after that. And that's why in the pre-phase, in the now phase, the bridges that can be built from the opposition to the bodies of these forces that can actually neutralize them, that can actually, perhaps better word, activate their nationalism rather than their penchant for penny pinching and having to fight to retain their social status or their economic status relative to people of equal command. Activate them to see the flag, or the future flag ideally, as more than a 3x5 piece of polyester. But that's the thing worth defending, not their foreign bank accounts or not their kids' apartments, unfortunately, in many Western countries these days. So the kind of outreach from the opposition, and again, this is an area where I'm weakest, but if you remember one of the phrases that activists in the street in '78 used to say to conscripts of the Imperial Army, because there was no riot control forces, it was just conscripts, they would put carnations, if you remember, in the barrels of the guns, in the barrels of the rifles. They would say, "Ma beto gol midim tove ma gulule." We give you flowers, you give us bullets. That neutralization, we need to think long and hard about what is the neutralization that we can do from a distance to the apparatus of repression and suppression in Iran? And what are the things already kind of on the dark web, already kind of among active Iranian protesters on the streets across the 150 protesting cities, towns, and villages from 2022, 2023, that we saw them do, that we can learn from, that we can amplify, that we can point out to our representatives? And how can we paint a pathway that isn't that tree-lined avenue that Kamran said at the beginning of our conversation?
Eyal, quickly, we'll get to Syria, and I want to stay on Syria with you, but on a positive note as we get to the end here, Israel, the current Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, have been very clear in distinguishing between the regime in Iran and the people of Iran. As we talked about lessons in Syria, transition, fall of the regime, if you could also answer, do you see a world in the future, a free Iran, where there's a military cooperation, military alliance between, or defense cooperation between the two nations?
I think the proper response has nothing to do with Syria, nothing to do with Netanyahu. The answer is yes, because as I said before, we aspire to an Iran that sees value in collaborating with Israel rather than wishing for its eradication. An Iran that is based on these principles can go back to have even far stronger relationships than were before 1979, because it was difficult back at the time for Iran to recognize Israel overtly, and everything was done under the fields, but so much has changed. We have normalized with so much of the pragmatic Sunni world. Why not have this with a country that is all based on intellect and deep tradition rooted in the area? I think there are many things to learn from what is happening in Syria. I would want to just say that if these conversations will lead to drawing conclusions from happening there, it meant that something went terribly wrong in the transition of this country. Because the runner-up of Iran is nothing like a former Al-Qaeda, maybe also a pro-Even Al-Qaeda, and Your Highness, your shave is far better than his. And I think that this is something to remember. This is not something to aspire for. This is not just a transition of power from one thug to the other. And the fact that this one is not close to the Iranians, is of course in favor of us, because it prevents the armament of Hezbollah. But what I usually unfortunately say about Syria, that this is a case where the enemy of your enemy is not your friend, not necessarily your friend. So there is nothing similar that I think should be aspired from this case. I truly hope that when the transition happens in Iran, this will show how this is done well, in a civilized manner, based on true vision of good future. Nothing like what we've seen since the so-called Arab Spring. There is nothing springly about it, but unfortunately it is very, very Arab.
I think that's about all the time we have, unless we have some closing remarks. Please.
Just something that Behnam was saying, I think it's important for everyone to realize. Part of the reason why people felt encouraged enough to put a carnation at the tip of the soldiers' guns was their knowledge that my father was not prepared to fire on his own people. In fact, he had given strict orders to the military not to fire on people. And that calculation was in the mindset of the revolutionaries. They knew that. Different to this regime that with impunity will not hesitate to order fire. Having said that, we should still stick to the discipline of non-violent civil disobedience as a method of change. Why is that important? Because the way we can neutralize is the idea not to repeat the de-Baathification process, with a simple principle that those who don't have their hands soiled with the blood of their own people should survive regime change. So we need to minimize the resistance at the very end. We're not going to disappear quietly, but it's far more of a manageable task than having to have street fights and civil war and guns spread all over the country and vigilantism, which will never lead us to stability and liberalization. Just want to make that note.
Amen.
May I add one, please? May I add one thing, sir? The very last thing, which is to the Prince's point, and I touched on it earlier, and Behnam talked about having difficult conversations and difficult truths. the Crown Prince has, as you've all heard, talked so many times and so frequently and so eloquently about the necessity of defections, just as you reiterated now. That's a very difficult thing to do, but you're a very principled man who is willing to say difficult things, difficult truths sometimes. I think there's a responsibility on everyone else, particularly on Iranians inside the country and the diaspora, not to have the Crown Prince being the only voice saying this. I mean, the military, the armed forces, even the IRGC have to hear this from their neighbors, from others, not just from the leader of this revolution and the transition leader, but from others. And how many times do you go on, X and see, I don't know, so-called activists or people attacking the Crown Prince for reaching out and trying to bring people from the Islamic Republic's armed forces, from the IRGC, to the side of the people. So if he's taking this difficult, principled stance, I just think it's on all Iranians to not let him be the only one making that argument and to reiterate what he's saying to others, because I think, as we all agree, the facts will prove that's the only way we'll be able to achieve this transition peacefully. So let's not let him be the only one making this case.
That's the end of the panel. Thank you all.